Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist. I'm based in Harley Street, London. I work in private practice psychiatry, and I'm delighted to be joined now by Chris Chambers. Chris Chambers is a professor of cognitive neuroscience in the School of Psychology at Cardiff University, and he's recently published a fascinating book entitled The 7 Deadly Sins of Psychology, a manifesto for reforming the culture of scientific practice. So, Chris, many thanks indeed for joining us for this interview, and thanks for your wonderful book, which is full of incredible research scholarship and erudition, but also very easy to read. The first thing to say is that your book, when you say the 7 deadly sins of psychology, what you mean is the science of psychology. Because many people, when they hear the word psychology, think about Silence of the Lambs and people sitting on a Freudian couch, self-help books. There's a vast psychological industry that popular culture is in contact with. But the notion of psychology as a science, psychologists working in laboratories conducting science, doesn't seem to be quite so widely known. What are your thoughts on that point?
Yes, I mean, it's a good opening question, because if you look at popular culture, as you say, psychology is portrayed as, I guess, more of an art in many ways, and perhaps a kind of a little bit of magic. Sometimes when I go to parties and whatnot, and people ask what I do, and I say I'm a psychologist, the first thing they will say is, "Oh, what am I thinking?" This kind of idea of this idea of psychology as some kind of series of parlor tricks or whatnot. But it's interesting, because psychology is, of course, a science. It is a very important science. It's a science that, in the last government review of science that took place in this country in 2014, produced hundreds of case studies about how traffic signs should work, and what strategies work best when it comes to ensuring that children learn best at school or revise well for exams, and developing therapies for helping people through difficult times in their lives, or through mental illness. I mean, psychology is right there in the middle of so much of society. And it's interesting, because when you give people these concrete examples of what it actually does, the penny drops and they realize, actually, yeah, this is obviously a very important field, and it is based upon a long history of scientific investigation. We can go right back into the 19th century to find the origins of psychology. And that is really what the book is about. It's about taking that core of science-led research and evidence-based practice and saying, are we doing this the right way? What can we be doing better?
The reason why I think this is a very important question as well is that this notion of psychology in pop culture, when you see a psychologist pontificating on TV or publishing a self-help book, or someone who claims to be a psychologist, this notion that there's a scientific background, a knowledge base to the statements is very important, because otherwise in popular culture it just looks to the public of psychology as either just basic common sense, or people make it up in some kind of intuitive sense. They're kind of like wise people who've had intuition. So the notion that it's a science is the notion there's a hinterland, there's a knowledge base, a background based on solid science, a bit like physics as a science, is something the public should be more aware of. They should question when they hear psychological claims on TV or the radio, where does that come from? Again, what are your thoughts about that?
Exactly, they should be. And indeed, I mean, if one of the outcomes of this book is that people pick this up and go, wow, I didn't actually realize that psychology had this quantitative scientific basis, then that's terrific. And then from that point, we can start to say, is it actually doing what it says on the tin? Is it as robust as, say, physics? One of the most interesting things about psychology is that it's an incredibly broad endeavor. So at one end, it kind of blends into biology and studies of the brain, which is in fact part of my own background is in neuroscience and neurobiology. So there's this element of psychology which traverses into that interesting sort of life sciences terrain. And then there's another end which moves into computer science and artificial intelligence, robotics. And then there's another end altogether which moves all the way out of science strictly and into more qualitative areas like cultural psychology and into the humanities and social sciences. So as a discipline, it's very far reaching. And I think that can make it challenging for people to really grasp, because you can be anywhere within this enormous space and call yourself a psychologist. It doesn't necessarily tell whoever you're talking to what exactly you're doing or what kind of research you're using to make judgments.
Now, we need to talk a little bit about what an actual science is, because you take, in my view, a very rigorous, very precise view of what a science is in the book. So if we think about social sciences like anthropology, sociology, economics, they're often very content without running actual experiments, in the sense that they will look at survey data and try to see correlations between different variables in a survey and do science in that way. You seem, and I may have got this wrong, to take a slightly dim view as to whether that kind of survey approach, as opposed to actual experiments, where you randomize subjects, let's say, to different conditions in an experiment. So you take a very rigorous, some people would say extremely rigorous view as to what a science is.
Well, actually, I would take contention with that, because the main point of the book is not to say that there is one way of doing science, and that is the direction of experimentation. Experimentation is obviously a major part of many sciences, because it enables you to really determine what's causing what in a very controlled context. But actually, the book is more about how do we draw inferences, how do we make decisions of judgment from results and from data, and how can we make those reliable? And a concrete example of this, you mentioned economics. So an economist doesn't have the opportunity to do a lot of experiments in a classical sense. What they will do is observe trends, correlations, as you say, look at large data sets, make predictions, forward and backward modeling, and so on. But actually, so is astronomy. If you're an astronomer, you're not doing experiments either. I can't do experiments on faraway galaxies. All I can do is observe, correlate, build theories, test them against observation, and then make judgments as to whether the theory is likely to be correct or not. It's really not about saying a science is one which does experiments. It's about saying, and really the message of my book overall is, how can we make the evidence as reliable and bias-free as possible?
Okay, so the book has lots of really interesting examples, and one of the reasons I like this book so much is these practical examples you give that are quite exciting. So the book starts with a really interesting experiment published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and the title of the paper was Feeling the Future, Experimental Evidence for Anomalous Retroactive Influences on Cognition and Affect. And this was published by Daryl BEM of Cornell University. And basically the experiment seemed to really turn science on its head and indicate that people could have some kind of foresight into the future. They could almost be clairvoyant. Could you tell us a little bit about the experiment and why this is such an important experiment? Because you believe this marks a turning point in the notion of what counts as doing proper psychological science.
This was a really key moment. So this was perhaps, when we look into the future now, somewhat ironically, and we look back at history, I think we'll find that the publication of that particular paper was the moment that psychologists realized something was very deeply wrong. And the reason is that Daryl BEM, in this iconic paper, used very standard methods. He used off-the-shelf psychological experimental methods, which are used routinely all the time in valid research, in legitimate research. And he sort of tweaked them in certain ways in order to test his hypothesis that the future could influence the past, and so that people could make these impossible predictions about what was going to happen. And what's most interesting about this is that he used, in that particular paper, there were 9 studies in that original paper, and each one of them was not obviously pseudoscientific, which is to say, there wasn't anything obviously wrong. He wasn't doing card tests or any of these kind of thoroughly debunked methods that have been popular within that sort of community for a long time, of the ESP community. He was using off-the-shelf standard robust methods, and it was producing ridiculous conclusions. And this is when the penny dropped for the psychological community, because if you could use standard off-the-shelf valid methods and get ridiculous conclusions, what does that say about all of the other areas where those methods are applied in a presumably sensible context? Why can we trust those conclusions, but not the conclusions from Daryl BEM's research on psychic powers? And so this is really when the storm broke, I think, in psychology, and statisticians started saying, look, we've been banging on about this for years, that you need to be exercising better control over bias in your experiments. You need to be using much more rigorous statistical standards. And then we can start talking about the evidence base in the field. But this was the key moment, really, I think, when everything started to turn and we realized that something was deeply wrong and we have to do something about it.
Could you say a little bit more, though, about what the ridiculous result was? What the experiment was saying that proved to be so ridiculous? Because it went against the basic tenets of science.
Well, it's impossible, yeah. So it basically, he was, for example, in one of his experiments, so let's go back a step. So there's a classic task in psychology called a priming task, where if I was to show you a picture of something very nice and positive that you like kittens, and then I was to show you that very quickly on a screen, and you don't have to do anything except just watch the kittens on the screen, and then a word was to appear, and you have to decide, is that word a positive word? And in other words, does it provoke a positive emotion, or is it a negative word? So a positive word might be happy, a negative word might be murder. Now, if I was to do this experiment with you, I was to show kittens on the screen, followed by a word, I would find that you're faster at making a positive judgment. So kittens prime the positivity, which then comes out in that word. So kittens followed by the word happy, you'll be faster than kittens followed by murder. And this is a well-known semantic priming effect that has been published many, many times. Now, what Daryl BEM did in one of his experiments is he reversed the order of this experiment. So first of all, he showed the words. So, for example, happy, murder. And then afterwards, he showed the kittens. And he claimed that the reaction time that people had to those words could be influenced by a picture of kittens that they hadn't even seen yet, okay, which is, of course, impossible, right? This is when your psychological experiment violates the laws of physics, you're wrong, because there is simply no theoretical explanation for that that's possible as our understanding of physics, goes. So what's key is if you look beyond the specific methods, and there are a number of them in this series of experiments that he published, none of them were particularly crazy. None of them were particularly, wow, I'd look at that and go, that's ridiculous. They were simply slightly modified versions of established paradigms. And so this is when the penny dropped, as I say, because when we looked at that evidence and we saw that he was experiment after experiment finding evidence for people being able to so-called feel the future, we realized that something must be deeply wrong with the way we're analyzing our data and the kind of inferences we're drawing.
But the other impression I got from reading about this fascinating experiment in your book was that Daryl BEM himself seemed to believe his result. Is that right?
Well, it's unclear what Daryl BEM believes, I think. I mean, he's an intriguing figure, really. I think he's been around in psychology for decades and has been a very kind of influential figure, for many years. I think he from what I understand from his other work, is he does believe there is something in this. He does believe that precognition or psychic powers are a real thing. But this goes against, the vast majority of scientific opinion. As I say, if your psychological theory conflicts with the laws of physics, it's wrong up until we change or discover new laws of physics.
Okay, so another really interesting study mentioned in the early part of your book is in 2012, a professor of psychology at Yale University named John Bargh launched a stinging public attack on a group of researchers who failed to replicate one of his previous findings. The study in question, published by Bargh and colleagues in 1996, reported that priming participants unconsciously to think about concepts related to elderly people, e.g. words such as retired, wrinkle, and old, caused them to walk more slowly when leaving the lab at the end of the experiment. Now, what happened was that there was a failure to replicate this finding, and then Bargh attacked the failure to replicate. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. So this was another interesting moment, and throughout the book I try to signpost these moments of controversy that have really sparked this reform movement in psychology, and this was one of them. John Bargh is a major figure, of course, in US psychology, and this failure to replicate provoked a really unusual response. It was very personal, very stinging. It was actually, in the end, I think it was actually removed from the internet the website that put it up removed his response because they considered it too inflammatory. But you can still read it on the archive. But I think it provoked a discussion about what is a replication. So these researchers went away and tried to repeat his experiment, could not do so, and they drew what they considered to be the most parsimonious conclusion, which was that the original study was wrong, despite the fact that it had been cited thousands of times and had spawned an entire subdiscipline within psychology on so-called social priming. It was most likely wrong, and they argued that it was perhaps due to experimenter bias or some form of bias in the process. But to zoom out from the specific experiment, the broader issue it drew attention to was, what does a failure to replicate mean? What is a replication? I mean, the debate from that point went in an interesting direction, because you had supporters of John Bargh saying, no, there's been loads of studies that have replicated that original finding anyway, so what does one failure to replicate really mean? And on the other hand, bizarrely, you had people saying it's never been replicated before. And I remember coming into this debate at the time. This was at around the time I was kind of making a lot of discoveries of my own about what's wrong with psychology. And I couldn't really reconcile how these two communities were arguing about this. How can they both be saying opposite things when they're dealing with the same evidence base? And of course, the answer in the end was that they were sort of both right and both wrong. There had been some replications of this original result, but none of them were exactly the same. Every time somebody redid the experiment, something was different, and it was reported slightly differently, or it only worked in people older than this, or it only worked in those who scored higher on this questionnaire beforehand, or whatever. So there were always these kind of caveats and always these what we call moderators to the original result. And it turned out that the original finding had never actually been directly replicated. And again, this is another big moment for psychology, because it drew attention to the fact that in the quantitative, science-based part of psychology, there's very little what we call direct or close or exact replication. And that has led to a whole number of reforms to try and boost the profile of replication, because replication is one of the fundamental tenets of science.
So I want to stay with this experiment because I think it's really interesting, because I think that I remember hearing and reading even today people making this claim about this result without realizing there's a serious problem as to whether it actually has been replicated. So it becomes true in the public mind or out in the community because people don't burrow into the fact that there's some controversy as to whether it's actually been replicated or not. So it's almost become an established fact that it's true.
This is it. And yes, exactly. And, there's a real danger. So there's a real danger that when people pick up a journal article in a glossy scientific, periodical, they draw the conclusion that because it's published, it's true. Because the results were statistically significant, it's true. Because I say the evidence goes this way, it supports my theory, it's true. And then the burden shifts on everyone else to find out that it's not true. And indeed, if it's very difficult to publish many of the times these failures to replicate, there's all sorts of reasons why journal editors are reluctant to publish them. The literature becomes a kind of one-way street of bias, confirmation bias in particular, where, there was, as the saying goes by a couple of colleagues of mine, psychology literature becomes a graveyard of undead theories, where you can't disprove any of them. You can't disconfirm any of them, and they kind of float around, and all you get is more and more claims and very little falsification or replication. So this is a very fundamental problem, I think, in the field that we're again starting to face now.
So we call this, and it's the first chapter of your book, the sin of bias. So if you could just summarize what this sin of bias is.
There's really two major biases that affect psychology. The first is publication bias. This is a bias that indeed goes well beyond psychology. It affects psychiatry as well, which I'm sure your listeners will be interested in. It's the bias toward publishing certain kinds of results over others. Imagine there are two studies done asking the exact same question, using the exact same methods, different researchers, different institutions. One of them finds a positive result, which is to say they find perhaps that a particular intervention is more effective in one group than another. And the second researcher doing the same study finds nothing. They find no difference. A publication bias happens when the result, the positive result, the result that shows a difference, is more likely to get accepted in the journal compared to what we call the negative result. That is the study that showed no difference. This is a very powerful bias because the way that our academic incentive structure is built and in many ways, the way we analyze data is based upon drawing conclusions from differences between things or correlations between things. So it's easier for me to build a story around a particular finding when I show that condition A is different from condition B, or it correlates or something like that, rather than I can't find anything. And because of this, journal editors are often reluctant to accept negative results in their journals. And this bias is incredibly short-sighted and terribly damaging, because what it does is it means that it creates a literature where there is a lopsided view of the world, because all you see is the studies that quote unquote worked. And if you do this enough and you publish enough studies with this bias, you could end up walking down a million blind alleys, because you will assume that all of these things are real, when in fact there's this vast unpublished file drawer of results which disagree with those which have never appeared in a journal. So publication bias is the first major problem we have in psychology. We know that it's very profound. We know that it's broad, it's deep, it goes beyond psychology. And indeed, when I talk about this to colleagues, one of their reactions is often, well, it's not just a problem in psychology, is it? This is a problem across most of science. In fact, even parts of the physical sciences suffer from publication bias. But we know that it's particularly bad in psychology. The second problem is what we call hindsight bias. This is, your listeners may be familiar with the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So this is a logical fallacy. Imagine you've got a cowboy with a machine gun standing in front of a barn wall, and he sprays the wall randomly with bullets. And then afterward, he looks where the bullets land and then draws the bullseye around where they happen to go. And then he claims he's an amazing shot. Nobody would believe that is accurate. That's a true reflection of what happened. This is a fallacy that infects a lot of psychological research, because such is the pressure on researchers to generate results that can get published in high-impact journals that they need to create stories out of their research studies. So even if the results that I get in a particular experiment are inconclusive or complicated, there's an enormous career pressure on me to extract some kind of clean narrative out of that. And one of the ways of doing that is to reinvent history. It's to mine my data set until I find something that I can build a story on, and then write my paper, my journal article, as though I predicted it in advance. And this is a practice known as hypothesizing after results are known, or harking. And it's a great example of hindsight bias, where we're trying to basically fool ourselves and others into thinking that something that was unpredicted was in fact predicted. These two biases, we see them reflected in a great deal of psychological research. And the reason I led with them in the book was because I wanted to set the scene for some of the reforms that are in place now and are growing to address both problems.
Now let's accelerate a little bit further into the book to chapter 5, when we talk about the sin of corruptibility, because I think this feels very similar, and it's to do with torturing data and the fact that people are seeking this holy grail of the p-value, the significance value has to equal 0.05, and every time they run the data analysis, they don't get this p-value, and they go back and look at the data to try and do something to it to get the p-value. So this is perhaps one of the most disturbing sins, because it comes close to just absolute fraud. Could you say something about this sin?
Yes, so I think this is, I think you referred to chapter 5. I think this is actually chapter 2, the sin of hidden flexibility. So this is a form of bias of its own. In fact, it's very much related to confirmation bias, publication bias, hindsight bias. But it's a particular manifestation of this, that essentially if you torture data enough, it will confess to anything. Now, on one version of this, a strategic researcher can engage in this practice deliberately, and that I would consider to be an act of misconduct. And so would many of my colleagues, and indeed many learned societies and institutions would consider deliberate cherry picking and selective reporting to be a form of misconduct. But it's not that simple, because there's many ways that when you're handling a complex data set that you can fool yourself inadvertently into seeing what you want to see and selectively reporting and engaging in this hidden flexibility, which is to say sometimes the hidden flexibility is hidden even from ourselves. And this is where it's particularly pernicious, because if you think you're doing everything right, then you're going to make quite strong claims. You're going to be able to stand up as somebody with integrity. Nobody's going to accuse you of doing anything wrong or lacking integrity. And so it perpetuates a lot of the bad inferences and bad evidence in the field. And the sin of hidden flexibility was really, there's a great example, which some of your listeners may have seen. Darren Brown, I think, brought this home beautifully in a show, a TV program he filmed about 10 years ago called The System. And the whole frame and basis of this program was that he claimed he had invented a way of guaranteeing that you would win at the racetrack. So when you put money on horses. And as proof of this, he recruited a member of the public to bet successively on horse races as she went along. Each time she put more money on, and she kept winning each time. Even on long odds, whatever, it would turn out that she was always going to win each time. And she got to after 5 or 6 of these races that she'd won, she was absolutely convinced that his system worked, and so she bet a very large sum of money. I think it was close to her life savings on the very final horse race. And it lost, and of course this was shocking and obviously very 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 upsetting for her. And the twist in the show was that in fact she was just one of over 7,000 members of the public that he had recruited to take part in this experiment. And what he had done is he told the story from the point of view of this one person who had won each time just by chance. And he had glossed over the thousands of other people that had taken part in the study and had been suppressed and had never been talked about. So it really did look like, from that point of view, that his system worked. But in fact, it was complete random chance. And the reason it was so powerful was because it capitalized on the selective presentation of the evidence. By only showing the path of success that she followed up until the very end, it produced a distorted view of reality. It's a wonderful demonstration of the sin of hidden flexibility. The good thing is, of course, at the end of the program, he reimbursed all of her lost life savings, so she didn't come out any worse for it. But it was a wonderful example of this kind of problem. Now, when I saw this, I realized that he had inadvertently described the way data analysis works in psychology. So in psychology, there are lots of big studies run, lots of complicated designs. And what researchers do is, even unconsciously, they'll navigate this enormous path, this garden of forking paths, as we call it, where there's many different ways through the garden to get to the end. And they'll basically find one path which produces very nice results, just like this member of the public in the horse races. And they'll present that as if that's the only path. It's a very dangerous form of inference, and it leads to, as I outline in that chapter, a number of bad decisions and basically a science that's built upon selective reporting.
Okay, let's talk about another sin further into the book called the sin of bean counting. So what is the sin of bean counting?
The sin of bean counting is part of the academic incentive structure. So academics, I think perhaps a lot of the general public don't really understand, why should they, how academics are assessed. There's a great deal of, there's a huge metrics culture in academia. So there are all sorts of numbers upon which I as an academic can be judged, the impact factor of the journals I publish in, or the number of papers I've published, the number of papers I've published where I'm the first author. The number of grants I've got, the cash value of those grants that I've received. There's all of this kind of very shallow metricization, as we call it, of science. And it's interesting because, science is basically a process of interpreting numbers in order to draw conclusions. And the process of assessing the caliber of scientists has also gone down this path of saying, well, since you're a scientist, I should be able to judge the value of your career and the contribution you've made to science based on some kind of, quantification of your research. And it's very dangerous and it's very bad practice. And in that chapter, I tried to draw attention to some of those, major problems that we face in academia and propose some sort of solutions to addressing them.
Let's talk a bit about the solutions. Towards the end of the book, you have a chapter entitled Redemption. And one of the things you seem to be proposing is the idea that people need to be a lot more transparent about their experiments and their research from the get-go, that they should register the study with journals or in some kind of registration process before the experiment begins. And then after the experiment's finished, the data analysis and so on and the hypothesis, it's more transparent what actually happened in the way the experiment was actually conducted. Can you say a little bit more about this solution that you're proposing?
Yes. So if the problem in psychology is that we have a biased evidence base, we have a lot of selective reporting, retractive results, we have a graveyard of undead theories, we have very little data sharing, we have very little transparency in methods and methodology. The solution has to be a more open approach generally. And so openness is a big concept. There's lots of ways to be open. You can make your data available, your code, if you're doing those types of analyses, your protocols. Now, the initiative you're referring to is what we call registered reports. This is one particular initiative within this scope of open science or open research, where the idea is to take the standard process for peer review and to radically change it in order to improve rigor. So for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with how peer review works at the moment for standard articles, what normally happens in psychology is that researchers will design a piece of research, they will conduct the research with perhaps certain hypotheses, they'll get their results in, they'll write their paper, so it'll have an introduction, a method of results, and a discussion. They'll send it off to the journal after the study is finished, and the editor and the reviewers will judge it on a number of different grounds. They'll say, is the question important? Is the method robust? But they're also saying, are these results striking enough, novel enough, exciting enough, interesting enough to warrant publication in my esteemed journal? And many papers in psychology fall on the sword at this point because the results just aren't attractive enough. And the pressures that psychologists face to produce attractive results drive so many of the other bad practices we talked about, like selective reporting, like various forms of hindsight bias and so on. Now, what registered reports does is it tries to neutralize this problem by splitting the research process in half. So what the researcher does now, if they're going to submit a registered report, is they design their study, they plan the analysis they're going to do of the data, but they don't start the study yet. What they do is they submit that bit, the front end, to the journal, where it's reviewed with no results. So the reviewers are now saying, yes, is the theory important? Are the hypotheses reasonable? Is the method robust? They're performing that part of the review process, but they don't know what the results are yet. So they're simply making a judgment based on the scientific quality of the research. And then if it goes through this process positively and after revisions, as normally happens, the reviewers and the editor decide that this is a good piece of research, then the journal accepts the study in advance and it says, provided you follow your protocol, we will publish the final paper regardless of which way the results turn out. The authors then go away, they've got their what we call in-principle acceptance from the journal, they go away and they do the research and they analyze their data, they write the rest of the paper, and then they complete the paper, they put it all back together again, and they resubmit it to the journal, where it's assessed again to say, did you follow the protocol? Are the conclusions based upon the evidence? But at this point, the journal can't say, we don't like your results. And they can't say, oh, having seen your results, we don't like your design. There are protections in there to prevent the kinds of biases we've seen from basically damaging the literature. So what you end up with is a form of publication which is very transparent. There is a rigorous review process at the front end based on quality and no suppression or pressure on researchers to publish certain kinds of results over others. And I spend quite a bit of time in the last chapter of the book talking about this initiative because when we created this initiative back in 2013 at one of the journals where I edit, it was it was a fairly radical idea in the field I was in, and I wasn't sure what would happen. Whether it would be something that would take off or whether it would die a quiet death in the corner somewhere. But since then, we've seen it really explode, and there are now over 200 journals which offer this registered reports format. I think it's one of the great hopes, really, for psychology and indeed for other fields, including psychiatry.
Okay, but in a way, this is a key moment because it goes to almost a philosophical question about what is science about, or what, in this case, is psychology about. Because what you're really saying is it's the method of the experiment that is the really important thing. And if you follow the method, then you should abide by the result, whatever the result is.
Yes, that's right.
But the thing is that students, people drawn into psychology, for example, because psychology is an incredibly popular degree, the reason why young people choose psychology is because of the exciting results. They read about the Stanley Milgram experiments, the obedience to authority. And there's a problem here, which is what grabs attention is the exciting result, or the unusual result, or the counterintuitive result. And what gets forgotten is the methodology by which the result is arrived at. And as some people will say, the danger of your plan is that if we do this methodologically rigorous stuff, which is the important bit, you're just going to get maybe a lot of very boring results at the end.
Wouldn't you rather know what's true? We can fool ourselves into building, bedtime stories and news stories for ourselves if we want. We can make it. Why do science at all? If the basis of research is simply to generate exciting stories for ourselves to read, then why do research in the first place? We're supposed to be in this to discover what's true about the world, how we can benefit others, how we can generate treatments that work, how we can discover how the mind works, how the brain works. Carl Sagan had a wonderful quote, which I use in the final chapter, and he says, "The method of science, as stodgy and grumpy as it may seem, is far more important than the findings of science." And I think there's nothing wrong. It's perfectly in the realms of human nature and perfectly understandable for us to get excited by certain findings. That's great. Certain results are exciting. I remember seeing the first images of that black hole that they took, the very first images of a black hole, and it's one of the most, it's a major moment for science. We've had those sorts of moments in psychology and over the last 100 years as well. But it's not enough. You can't hinge everything on the exciting finding. You have to make sure that what's under the bonnet, what's in the engine, is actually reliable. Otherwise, it's all built on sand in the first place. So the idea of registered reports, and indeed the wider open science movement, isn't to crush the excitement. It isn't to say, no, we don't care about exciting results. It's to say, let's focus on building an engine that can get us to the place where exciting results are actually meaningful and can be believed rather than distrusted. Because if you build a system, as we do in psychology, as we have in psychology and in many other fields, where everything is based upon the exciting result and we don't pay very much attention to the theory or the methodology, all you end up with is exciting results and groundbreaking findings which don't replicate, and they're not real, and we shouldn't be using them to make decisions. So it requires a kind of mental discipline. And it's interesting that you mentioned students and younger people coming into science, because, in fact, over the last 7 years that I've been promoting this message and trying to build these reforms, the strongest message in favor of them has been from the students, the early career researchers, the graduate students, because they're the ones that really want to discover what's real about the mind and build interventions that work and understand the brain and so on. They're the ones who are not jaded by the academic system and the incentive structures that many senior researchers face. So I think it's very positive. Looking forward, I actually think a focus on open science and rigorous methodology and rigorous theory is the solution to generating an exciting evidence base that we can trust.
Well, I agree with you that the pursuit of truth is the important thing. But what I'm saying to you is there's a tension between the pursuit of truth and other rather deep drives within human beings. Now, the whole point of universities and science was meant to be this place that protected the truth, where people were examining the truth, even if the truth was boring or unpalatable or threatening or challenging. That's the whole ethos of what a university and science and the scientific pursuit of the truth is about. But what your book reveals is even within the academic community, there's a large group of people who are not that bothered about the truth because the truth may turn up boring results.
Yes,
there are other drivers in play. That's the key point. The truth is in conflict with really powerful other drivers. That's what your book, I think, is really one of the really interesting things about your book is that conflict between those two opposing forces.
Absolutely. That's a very good summary, and it's a very apt summary, because what you've essentially got at the moment in psychology and beyond psychology is a conflict between what's best for the individual scientist, which is a lot of high papers in high-impact journals, a lot of grant funding, a lot of esteem, a lot of prestige, a lot of getting great results, right? That's good for me as an individual career scientist. But what's best for the community is very different from that. What's best for the community is a corpus of knowledge that we can trust, we can make decisions from, we can build theory from, we can share, we can use to generate treatments, we can benefit society. We can honor the contribution from the taxpayer who's funding all of this research in the first place, right? There's a conflict between those two, what's best for the community and what's best for the individual. Now, if you set a system up like this, where what's best for the individual conflicts with what's best for the community, we know what's going to happen. People will do what is in their own self-interest, always, every single time. Tragedy of the commons. If you set that up like in that way, you will find that the individual always wins, even to the detriment of the community. And so we have to look at this as a systems problem. You have to say, how do we fix this? Well, the obvious solution is bring the incentives into alignment. Make what works for the individual also work for the community. And this is what Registered Reports does, because it works for me as an individual. If I can submit my protocol, my introduction and my method to a journal and get that accepted in advance of actually doing the research, I can now perform the research in a stress-free way. I no longer have to worry about getting a particular result, or that particular result is going to have a major effect on my career because I won't be able to publish it if it's non-significant or negative or confusing or uninteresting. And it's good for the community because now the community gets a reflection of the truth of reality. They get to see the unvarnished truth of what my experiment or my study actually showed. And I think there's a real lesson there of aligning the incentives. I think you put it very nicely in the kind of conflict you proposed. And I would say it's a conflict between the individual researcher and the community in which that researcher resides.
But one of the reasons why, again, I think your book's really interesting is that psychology of all the sciences, with this issue about the truth being a precious thing that has to be protected, is a more searing issue, because psychology represents a threat to most ordinary people because it challenges some of their most cherished beliefs. Because a psychologist is saying to the ordinary individual, yes, I know you believe that, but is it true? So, for example, one of these psychologists I've interviewed has published a book on faces and personality. And one of the most cherished beliefs that the public have is that they can read personality from faces. So, and it's an old idea. Someone looks like they're a bit of a psychopath from their facial structure, and people assume they're a psychopath. This is a cherished belief that people have. So psychology becomes a dangerous science because psychologists keep saying to people, yes, I know you believe that, but is it true? And that's one of the key problems, in that people aren't threatened by physics. If physics comes along and questions, for example, is it true your belief about time, that time is constant? Einstein comes along and says, actually, time changes. Time can slow down. Time can speed up, depending on the powerful gravitational field that you're in. People are less threatened by that. Psychology is more dangerous because if you keep saying, yes, but is it true, people find that very threatening personally. And that's why psychology is in a more difficult place, I think, as a science. Again, I wonder what your views are
Yes.
about that.
I mean, this is any science that lives closer to the human experience will find that whatever results it produces will have a greater effect on humans, and also will be perceived more viscerally, perhaps, by the community. So, as you say, if you're a physicist or a chemist, a lot of your discoveries, whilst being absolutely vital for the rest of science, will not be of great applicative value to your average member of the public. Where if you're a psychologist and you're far out on that sort of applied sphere, because that's where a lot of psychology resides, your findings are going to have more implications. And if they are counterintuitive, yes, they will perhaps be viewed with a combination of awe, suspicion, interest, Psychology gets a lot of attention in the media. And as I said in the beginning of this chat, that it also is very prominent in the Research Excellence Framework, which is the way the government assesses the quality of research in the country every 5 years or so. There is a great deal of value in psychology and a great deal of impact. And for me, this just raises the stakes. If I'm a psychologist and my research has the potential to change the way people think about their lives, their choices, their assumptions about each other, their position in society, then the onus is on me to ensure that I take every step possible to generate results that are accurate and to not allow my own biases, either driven by my own desire to be successful in my career or those that are placed on me by my system, the academic system. The onus is on me to try and change everything to make sure that my studies are as reliable as possible. So I would say this just makes it all the more important that the kinds of initiatives that I talk about in the book are actually adopted.
Okay, so one final question. Let's talk about an uncomfortable question, perhaps, about how your book has been received within the academic community, because you're open about the fact, in this edition at least that I've read, that it's not gone down well in some parts of the academic psychological world.
This is a good thing. I think if you write a book on scientific reform and everybody agrees with you, you're probably saying something pretty innocuous and pretty beige. You have to stir things up a little bit in order to change things. Now, what's interesting, I think, about the response to my book is that it's really a wider response to the open science movement in general in psychology. You've got to remember that academia is a very hierarchical system. And of course, a lot of your listeners will find that this is also true in psychiatry, I'm sure. Very hierarchical. There are a lot of people at the top who got there by doing things a certain way. The proof that there is nothing wrong with the field is that they have careers and they made it to the top. And of course, they only got there on merit. And so, of course, everything's just fine. Thank you very much. What are you talking about? Go home. Now, this is a reaction that was very strong at the beginning. So if you go back to 2012, 2013, in the wake of BEM and Starple, this major fraud case we haven't talked about, but there were a number of these drivers which got this discussion going. If you go back to that time when we introduced registered reports and there was all this drive toward open science in psychology, there was a significant pushback from the senior levels of academia especially, who saw this as, a witch hunt and the Stasi and shameless bullies and all of this kind of rhetoric, all this nonsense, frankly. The reaction was fascinating, I thought, from a kind of sociological point of view, because it emphasized something that Machiavelli said back in the 16th century, that the innovator has for enemies all of those who did well under the old system. And you see this born out of the reaction that we got to many of these initiatives. But what I've been encouraged by, and depending if you saw the paperback version of the book, you would have read my updated preface, is that since then we've seen a remarkable change happen. And a large part of that change has been driven by junior scientists within the field who have said, actually, this is the way we should be doing science anyway. We shouldn't be arguing about whether or not we should be making psychology more robust, more reliable, more open, more transparent, more believable. We should be simply doing this in the first place. And this is a debate that we shouldn't really be happening. We should simply be doing this as a matter of course. And so in the debate since the early days of 2012-13 has shifted from, is there a problem, to how do we solve this problem? And so now, initiatives like the registered reports, which we discussed earlier, they're absolutely burgeoning. 200 plus journals, lots of published examples, spreading to different fields. I think the overall reaction now, I'm very optimistic about the future.
Chris Chambers, thank you very much indeed. The title of your book, The 7 Deadly Sins of Psychology, a Manifesto for Reforming the Culture of Scientific Practice, is available now from Princeton University Press. Chris, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.